Hi everyone, my name is Alex and welcome back to Magic Missile Minis. Today, I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a troll miniature for D&D. So, I start by taking a little bit of this copper wire. It's a little bit thicker, so it's better for these larger projects, and essentially make the armature the same way that I would normally, but obviously just at a bigger scale. My thought for the proportions of this was that he would have two larger arms and smaller legs. So he's kind of had a little bit of a gorilla kind of look to him, but not quite. I then start to pose the miniature. My thought for this guy was that he would kind of have one hand on a rock and he'd be kind of leaping over it with another rock in his hand. Whenever I pose a miniature, I always start by adjusting the hips, the back, and the collarbones. That generally helps make these poses look really, really dynamic because when people are like moving, those spaces are never stagnant. Here I add a large piece of cork and superglue it onto the base I'm going to use, and that's going to be the stone that he's leaping over. I then make sure that I have a little bit of extra of the wire on the one arm that I stab into the cork so that he has a nice firm hold, supergluing that into place. And then the entire miniature gets wrapped in green stuff. Once the first layer of green stuff is fully set, I go on and start adding some of the anatomy. For this miniature, I wanted to, rather than have him feel kind of like ogreish and kind of lumbering, I wanted him to actually be like fairly built. I thought it'd be interesting for trolls as opposed to like ogres to not be like fat and huge, but these trolls are actually like really, really fit and fast and agile. I thought it would be kind of an interesting take on a troll. Also, working on a slightly larger miniature was a good excuse for me to practice anatomy, focusing on all the different muscle groups and really trying to play around with them and get better at and getting used to the different kind of muscle groups that do exist on a slightly larger scale, so that when I make smaller miniatures, I have a better idea of what I'm trying to replicate on a smaller scale. As you can tell, this sudden shift is a 3-year gap between when I started this project and when I picked it back up again. I was halfway through working on this project when I had stopped making videos, and so this half-finished project has been rolling around in my hobby box for, again, 3 years, and so it's kind of fun to go back to him and actually finish this project I've been looking at for literally 3 years now. Once I finish up with all of the anatomy, I start working on the feet, and I decided I didn't really want to sculpt feet, so instead I decided I would give this guy hooves, because it just seemed a lot easier, and I thought it'd be that nice little balance that you gotta strike between this is a lot easier to do, and it's kind of a cool, interesting artistic choice. You know, you gotta mix it up a little bit, find the balance so that you don't end up just working on things that you don't want to do because it's going to take forever. And sometimes you can use creative choices to help that process of making things also a lot easier on yourself. I then carve out a piece of cork from a little cork board that I have to work on the stone that he's going to be carrying in his other hand. Using a little bit of super glue, I stick that in place before going in with some green stuff to start sculpting in the hand. Generally speaking, when you're sculpting hands, it's a good idea to have your characters holding something, especially if you're not super confident in sculpting hands, because it gives you something to sculpt on top of and not having to worry about finicky little details that are kind of floating in air without any supports. I find it's just a really great trick, especially if you don't want to sit there working on it and having to possibly ruin it over and over again before you get it right. If you have your character holding a staff, or in this case a rock, you have something to sculpt onto, and it just makes the whole process a lot easier. I then start working on the head of the miniature. I take a little blob of green stuff, I stick it at the end of one of my tools, and I start manipulating the green stuff to form a little bit of a pseudo skull for the miniature, primarily focusing on getting the jaw and mouth in the position I'm going to need it to be when I start adding more details. While that sets, I decided I wanted the entire miniature to be covered in fur. Since the miniature didn't have a ton of extra details on him, I thought having an interesting texture would help make sure that it's not just a bunch of anatomy, there's actually something to latch onto when you look at the mini. I played around with different ways of doing it. Eventually, I settled on just sticking a large piece of green stuff onto the miniature and pressing that into place with one of my rubber tools to make sure I'm not losing any of the details of the anatomy I did underneath it. Taking this metal tool, I cut little V's and X's into the shape, overlapping one another to create a fur texture. I found this actually worked really, really well, especially for a miniature where I'm trying to cover the entire thing in fur. There's a lot of different ways of doing this, but this one worked really well for this mini. I then start working on the second step for the head, adding in the eyes. I had actually forgotten how I do this normally, and I started drilling holes in the mini, which doesn't make any sense because you can just sculpt in the round circles and they stay in a lot better. So I sculpt those in place, and then in this lovely blurry footage, beautifully focused on the mat that I'm using as a background, I start adding some teeth to the miniature. I start here by adding 2 large tusks. I saw a drawing of a troll that had like really massive tusks, and I thought that was really cool. So I added that to the miniature, as well as going around and adding the rest of the teeth and letting all of that set completely before I move on to the next step for the face. At this point, we can start finishing up the face, and I always start by adding a brow to the miniature so I can start figuring out what kind of expression I want him to have. For him, he's got this big Neanderthal brow that's going to be very furrowed, obviously because he's like yelling and jumping over a rock, so he's not going to be calm and relaxed. To put the mini's head in place, I take some green stuff and just stick a big old blob right on the little copper wire that was sticking out, and then stick him in there, and then use some of my tools to kind of blend the two together to make sure there's a solid hold between the head and the body of the miniature. I then decide I need to finish out the base, and so I take some of AK Interactive's Dark Earth terrain, which is this kind of textured paste that gives a great sandy, dirty ground texture to any base. I bought this a little while ago, and it's super, super helpful for basing minis. But this is the finished miniature, which means it is time to get to painting. As of right now, I'm still using a paint-on primer. It's technically for an airbrush paint, but I don't have a spray can or anything. So I just brush this on, trying to do 2 thin coats to make sure I don't lose any of the details that I added. As a base coat for this miniature, I take some of Citadel Colors Macarage Blue and some Vallejo Model Colored Black and mix them together to create a dark blue that I cover the entire miniature in. I do this with my miniatures to make sure that there is a unified shadow color. So every single color is going to blend into this one shadow color, which means that it feels like the mini is in a blue-ish space. Here you see I am dry brushing on a little bit of gray to give the miniature a kind of lightish gray fur color. Again, I want this guy to feel like he's in a snowy area. I then go over the face of the miniature with a dark purple. This is going to be the base coat for the different skin tones, so I cover almost all of it. I try to leave the darkest areas still that blue so that there's a unity in the miniature still. I go over the miniature with progressively lighter and lighter purples until eventually I come up with a nearly skin tone color. I hadn't anticipated when I was mixing the colors that it would essentially turn into just a neutral skin tone, but with the purples as the kind of base for that, it's kind of cool. Again, I wanted this miniature to feel cold, so it almost feels like the skin is cold itself, because like when you get really cold, your skin gets a little bit purple, so it's almost like his skin is permanently in this kind of almost pneumonia-ish state, but he's a troll, so it doesn't matter. I don't know. I think it was a little bit evocative of that kind of feeling of really cold skin, so I kind of like that it ended up being the color that it was, even though I didn't really plan for it. I then start working on the eyes, adding a dark red and then a slightly lighter red color so that it looks like they're glowing a little bit before going in with a needle on a pin vise and a little bit of white paint to create a little shine or dot in the eye. Once that's finished, I go to his mouth with a purpley red paint, and then I start going over his teeth with a yellow ochre. It's a bit of a bright color, but I'm going to go over this with a dark wash to make the color not quite as intense. I also make sure to hit his fingernails as well as his hooves with this color. Before I go over that wash I had mentioned, I add a little bit of brown to the hooves specifically because obviously these are going to be a little bit dirtier, and because they're also bigger, I wanted to add a little bit of nuance in the color. Here, in this lovely blurry image, you see me adding in that dark brown wash that darkens the whole thing and brings out the details and just makes it look a little bit less intense. After that, I start working on his little tunic. This part of the project, I essentially wanted it to be a purplish brown. I didn't want to use any specific like intense browns because it would be a little bit too red for this miniature. So I added a little bit of purple and I really just played around with it. I ended up doing a lot of wet blending and kind of seeing where the highlights and tones landed. I didn't have a really specific idea of what this was going to look like. Again, kind of like the skin. I just kind of went for it to see what it would look like in the end. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. This also ended up being a very bright color. So just like the hooves and teeth, I went over everything with a dark brown wash to get into all the crevices and make the color look a little bit more worn and not quite as intensely bright. With that, the main part of the paint job was finished, so I go over the base with a couple dry brushes, one with a little bit of brown and another with a more gray for all of the rocks to bring out the different textures of the texture paint I had added for the base, as well as the stones. And then as another little detail, I add some red a blood effects paint to the rock and finishing up the miniature with a brown wash over the base to bring out all the details of the stone and the texture paint. And last but not least, I add a nice little bit of black paint around the base to cover any paint that might have slipped off to make the miniature look nice and clean. And with that, this project is finished. I'm quite pleased with this miniature. I'm really happy with how his pose looks. I think his face looks really, really dynamic. I'm really proud of the paint job as well. I like the kind of the blue hue to the entirety of the miniature. It kind of makes the mini look a bit cold, like he's either in a cave or in kind of a snowy, colder area. I don't know. I'm really happy with the paint job itself. The purple skin going into the skin tone I think is really cool as well. The base is a bit plain. I wish that I had done a little bit more detailing on the base. It's just kind of one blanket color, which is fine, but it would have been more interesting to add some other details or done a slightly more interesting paint job. But I'm quite pleased with it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check out my band. Again, we're called Kin. There's links in the description for all of that. And this is what one of our songs sound like. Images I hope to hold and burn into my head. So if you enjoyed that sound, go check out our music, links in the description, go check out Spotify as well as our Instagram. And before you leave, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, leave a comment, do all the algorithm things. It really helps the channel a lot. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Your fear is old and real, but know that I am older, and I have seen these things come and then pass over. I know that this feels near, but know that I am closer, but know that I am closer, but know that I am closer, know that I am closer, know that I am closer.